Track 2.
Seema Says No by Annie Jeffrey. The sun rose over the desert. It cast long sunbeams and formed shadows in the dunes around the village. The early morning rays came through Seema's window and woke her. She tiptoed quietly out of the hut, careful not to wake her grandfather. Outside, her grandmother was sitting on a mat. She had already bathed, dressed, and painted the bindi on her forehead using red powder. A bindi is a red dot that is worn by Hindu women when they are married. Seema and her grandmother ate their breakfast of fresh bread and warm, salty camel's milk. Then they waited for Seema's friends. Together, Seema and her friends walked to school. They walked past the salt lake and greeted their fathers, uncles, and brothers, who were already working there. They were digging salt out of the lake and forming it into big piles. Some were carrying the salt in buckets to a cart. Seema waved to her uncle Arjun. Usually he smiled and waved too, but today he looked away and continued digging. Just outside the village, they stopped to drink some cool water from the community tank. The sun was already strong, and the water was just what they needed. When they reached the school, they left their sandals outside the classroom and went inside. The first class was math. Mrs. Thakur was very strict, but she was kind too, and she taught her students well. After showing them some equations on the blackboard, she gave them a test. Math wasn't her best subject, but Seema chewed her pencil and concentrated hard as she answered the problems. During recess, the children played outside while Mrs. Thakur sat on a bench grading the papers. Later, she spoke to each of them one by one as she handed the tests back. She had special words of praise for Seema. "Every day you try harder and get better," Mrs. Thakur told her. "I'm very happy with your progress." As Seema and her friends walked home, the sand was scorching hot, burning their feet even through their sandals. So they rested for a while under a large tree, as they usually did, and played games in the shade. They played Satoliya by piling up flat stones, then hitting them with cloth balls to knock them down. Then they played kancha, or marbles, with small round stones. Back in the village, they raced each other up the highest dune. "The last one up buys us all ice pops at the market," laughed Seema when she got to the top. Then they all said their goodbyes. "See you tomorrow, everyone!" shouted Seema. Seema burst into her hut excitedly. Her grandmother was preparing a delicious red curry and toasting the thick roti they would use to mop it up. Her grandfather was sitting on a cot. Seema couldn't wait to tell her grandparents about her math grade, But before she opened her mouth, something stopped her. Usually, her grandmother's smile was wider than the village lake, but now her face was serious. "Has something happened?" Seema asked. "Your Uncle Arjun visited this afternoon," said her grandmother. Seema suddenly remembered her uncle's unusual behavior in the morning. "He came to tell us that he has found a husband for you. Our family will meet him and his family soon. Then you will be married in October." October was only 2 months away, she thought sadly. She shouldn't be surprised, but she was. Her cousin Roshan got married when she was only 9. Seema was already 13. "Since your parents died, your grandfather and I have taken care of you," explained her grandmother. "But you know that your uncle supports all of us." Seema's head was spinning and she felt sick. She forced herself to speak. "Please, don't make me get married," she said quietly. "Not yet. I want to get married one day, but I want to finish school first." "We know, Seema," said her grandfather gently, "and we understand. But your uncle has the final word." The next day at school, Seema couldn't concentrate. She got everything wrong, and Mrs. Thakur spoke sharply to her twice during class. As everyone packed up their books, Mrs. Thakur asked Seema what was wrong. When Seema told her, Mrs. Thakur frowned. Seema walked home with her friends as usual, but this time she didn't join in any of the games when they stopped in the shade. Seema's Uncle Arjun was a good man. He worked hard every day at the salt lake for very little pay. Like Seema's grandparents, Uncle Arjun had never finished school. Seema knew that as an unmarried girl, for him, she was another mouth to feed. "I don't want to get married, Uncle Arjun," she said nervously. "Not until I've finished school." "Seema is a good student," said Seema's grandfather. "Her teacher says she is one of the smartest the school has ever had. Look how hard we have all worked, Arjun," her grandmother added. "If Seema finishes school, she will have a better life." Uncle Arjun shook his head. "My decision is final," he said. As he turned to leave, he looked over his shoulder at Seema. "I'll be back tomorrow, and I hope that by then you will understand." The next day, Seema brought Mrs. Thakur home with her. Uncle Arjun was there again. "Uncle Arjun, I want to show you something," said Seema. She went to the other side of the hut. A moment later, she brought back a large photo and her grandmother's red powder. "This is my school photo from 2 years ago, Uncle," she said. Seema held up the photo, and they all looked at the smiling faces of the children sitting in rows in front of the school. Then Seema dipped a finger in her grandmother's powder. Carefully, she marked a red dot, a bindi, on 5 of the girls' foreheads. "These girls are all married now, so they don't come to school anymore," she said. She pointed to the last girl she had marked. "And this is Anita. She used to be my best friend. Now she is not allowed to play with us. She stays at home to cook and clean for her husband." Seema paused. "I don't want to be like Anita, Uncle. I want to be a teacher like Mrs. Thakur." Everyone looked at Mrs. Thakur, and she smiled. "If you allow Seema to stay in school," she said, "I will make sure she gets a place next year in the upper secondary school. Seema is a promising student, and I will apply for a government grant to pay for her studies. After she has finished studying, she can come back and teach at the school with me." Uncle Arjun thought for a long time about what Seema and Mrs. Thakur had said. At last, he said he would think about it. Seema waited. What would her uncle decide? On the last day of July, the sun rose and woke Seema as it always did. As she ate breakfast with her grandmother, Seema showed her this year's school photo. She pointed to two girls in the front row. "These are my friends, Rangjot and Riju," she said. "Their parents wanted to make them get married too, but after I said no to Uncle Arjun, they had the courage to say no too. None of the girls at school got married this year." Then Seema joined her friends and walked to their school for the last time. She was very happy. Her uncle had decided to let her stay in school. Next year, she would be going to the upper secondary school.